Now, there are many fraudulent arguments which have been conveyed, similar to the support for the expiration of legal pursuit remedies, similar to the case of, I believe it was a man who was convicted and sentenced to jail and therefore was subject to the restraints of prison, which then was sued by or provided a divorce by his wife, who wanted to separate because of the crime and the prison, which then allowed for the default to settlement, which goes into her favor because of the prison, which by definition is a fraudulent argument, as the position of the obstructions requires the legal right to access the courts by the party, at which point the person receiving the divorce offer has all of the time in prison to exclusively think about the divorce, which by definition should have a right to access the courts or the legal systems and all of its paperwork and representation along the normal policies, which by definition would give them a right to have exclusively focused on the divorce settlement throughout all of that time, and therefore is an ongoing period for that time, as opposed to the position which many of them suggest for the obstruction, where they are not allowing access to the courts or to the legal paperwork which is being obstructed or destroyed underneath their control against the POWs arrested for being the elites of the obstructed position of the United States free market, which, having been arrested by the communists, engaged in the degrowth by replacing them, selling their laundered profits to their terrorist criminals with various benefits by having access to the contracts which are viable because of the lower market derived by the absence of the original elites, which would have serviced it, which would have already sucked up the opportunity. And the obstruction being for the purposes of taking the opportunity in order to prevent the money speech from the contract schedule estimated materializes its resurrection and therefore is disqualified from the same comparison. These two things being fundamentally separate would, if they were the same thing, either a violation of the rights and therefore disqualification of the authority of access to the function, which by definition would demand an extension, or alternatively allow the other person in their example to have had access to the courts, where they would have actively exclusively focused on the divorce issue, where they, being sent from the prison to the courts to actively speak on the issue, would be able to afford whatever nest egg, which would include anything that they would have by definition wanted to save, could by definition spend the time in the court instead of the prison, and therefore waiting around in the court would either directly be dealing with the judges complying on normal schedules or being delayed, such as a retaliation for the contempt of inmates, which is a possibility, which in any case is irrelevant, as the cost of the function of the person being restrained in that condition, having to wait around in a safe courthouse, is entirely separate, and therefore the cost, by definition, is not the cost of what it looks like directly on its face, but it is a cost spent on protecting the assets which would have otherwise been lost in the prospect threat, such as the settlement and the divorce, where the other person would have taken the resource, at which point being able to dissolve it or be able to trade the various functions through the caveats which, not being obstructed from it, is a lawful right, would be able to have access to its consumable products, and therefore be able to do Uber Eats or something along these lines under the security apparatus, which then would, if the court was to be delayed, such as by judicial activism as retaliation, be able to order in, wait in the courthouse, and then feed the judge. And, you know, the records on statistics say that judges that have eaten and are not stressed are more likely to provide more complicit verdicts, and therefore being siding with one side over another would not be anxious or stressed and retaliatory, which would be the interest, and therefore those resources would actively have amplified it as an advantage as opposed to a disadvantage of the extortion, misusing the system in order to engage in the necessary delays for the expiration. This, of course, is exponentially amplified if the former employers of the party, which is not specifically understood, but if they would be able to provide the position of contract opportunities of quotas, facilitating the function of work to be able to be done at a certain level, to be able to convey the transfer from one thing to another, would actively allow for consistent restoration of finances, facilitating higher and higher luxuries to that position as the Uber Eats orders into finer and finer dining. This being sent to the party in the courthouse would then just be waiting patiently and non-disruptively inside of the courthouse while they eat their meals and provide it to the judge and the rest of it. Now, it is understood that the court, being the authority, is over the judge, and therefore the judge, as an officer or a subject to the court, is subject to its authority and its limitations, as the mechanism is, by definition, the authority as a whole, and therefore judicial activism or bad faith would allow for judicial review of other judges in different courts, which would then subsidize and rebalance the system in case there was any misbehavior on their part, which in this example is not super relevant. The issue then materializes the position of all of its other agents, such as the bailiffs and whatnot, which then allows for the consistent maintenance of that system as a subordination to the legal procedure, providing the authority of the office in its subordination. And therefore, the function, having placated this position, allows for the exclusive attention to whatever of these issues is actively being suspected, according to that arrangement, which the person in that scenario only has that one thing to think about. Other people have everything in their life to think about, and that person, having lost everything in their life, only has the one thing directly in front of him, as he, in that scenario, would have the right to pursue the remedy. But the obstruction of the pursuit of the remedy, such as in the War on David tactics, materializes an alternative subversion by the fraudulent use of illegal policies before review, which is protected by the fact that the arrest of the patriarchy maintains the position of their congressional intelligence oversight, which would enforce the impeachments and other systems which are being obstructed from that action, and therefore contempt for Congress and contempt for court is fundamental to the subversion in question, which is being conducted by the bad faith, such as the judicial activism, for the subversion in order to engage in the evolution of the Confederate policies, which, having received treasonous payoffs by the Soviet Union, has automated the systems of the black market in order to fund or subsidize their bad faith behavior, protected by other insurrectionists who are also disqualified from the lawful access to the authority of the government, such as the court, which, being over them, has every right to bar them from access. So fundamentally, these are entirely separate issues. Now, these compounding crimes from that effect include the position of targeting David Bowles amongst the other elites, who, having been restrained in order to stop the money speech from the contract schedules, which would have made them the aristocracy, or in David's case, the patriarchy, has a contract schedule which is the acknowledgement of registered companies and contracts of projected profits, which they, having seized in takings, wish to not pay the takings price from the fair market price estimated, which is the motive of them doing it, amounting to a criminal armed robbery, which is the fraudulent mechanism specifically prohibited by the Constitution as a punishment without due process, which then facilitates the process as an extortion or a retaliation with the obstruction of the pursuit of the remedy, which then, as an action of retaliation, maintains the action that the ability to pursue the remedy is being actively obstructed and therefore delayed, requiring the right of the pursuit of the remedy to be restored, which would correct against those coercions and obstructions, forcing them to pay the takings price of the contract schedule, which amounts to the position of the patriarchy in David Bull's case, which then manufactures their obligation to pay the full restoration of those faculties, including paying the compensation of the fair market price to replace the faculties which, having been seized, were not properly managed and then obstructed and then broken, requiring for the complete replacement with new faculties according to the ship of Damocles or the ship of Theseus, whichever is more, I think it's Theseus, yes, it's the ship of Theseus, which by definition comes up with the thought experiment. What do you do with the captured ship of Theseus, which, having been put in a museum, begins to rot? When it rots, you replace the wood with new wood, and therefore the ship of Theseus is preserved throughout the ages. Is the ship of Theseus the new replaced wood, or is it the old wood if you had made a copy of it using the rotted wood and made a different one? Is the old one the ship of Theseus, or is the new one the ship of Theseus? The answer, by definition, is they both are. To be fair, the war of attrition by the obstruction of the takings, which then would materialize the inability to fund the thing, obstructs the money speech, which is at its core the motive of their insurrectionist plot, making the height of the crime each and every day. David Bowles is abused and therefore disconnected from those rights specifically connected to his human decency and status, amongst others, specifically allotted in law, which would, as an extension of those things, be connected to those resources fundamental to that concept, materializing the obligation of its restoration in order to preserve the lawful function of the system, which is the authority of the government, and therefore the authority of the court, and therefore the rebellion against the court and contempt for court by the refusal to comply with that authority, and therefore the refusal of complicity with the authority of the court would then subordinate the position as bad faith by the judiciary or other court actors who, by definition, becoming disloyal to the court, engage in contempt for court and contempt for Congress as the continuation, as the height of the crime is each and every day the government goes without the officers being obstructed in the criminal intention of the obstruction of the officer in his official proceedings, which is their core motive and therefore the purpose of the extortion. This includes the arrangements of various exchanges in the RICOs, which, having a flavor towards the position of the original value, such as the original associates, would then reconnect to an outside party who, not being the person, is in violation of the agreement, which has to have engaged with the party or the person themselves, which requires the restoration of the title, which by definition, is a series of fraud from a RICO extortion in order to hyper-concentrate power for the communist insurrectionist motive in the RICO case, which they are using as a mechanism of the extortion in order to deplete the resources in the war of attrition, engaging in reversing the strength into a weakness as the mechanism of the obligation of its restoration has many retaliations, including the competition to the original status, which have at the interest of his continued absence, as is demonstrated by their progression with their assistance in the criminal market with the Communist Insurgency Party, which then maintains the position of the degrowth and therefore the absence of David and the other elites from the market, allowing for the opportunities to be available for them to take over with their policies as a replacement, and therefore assist in the funding and distribution of the abuses as a retaliation for economic violence, as a retaliation to the competition, similar to the structure of the purging of competitions in the war on terror as a war strategy conveyed against civilians in the Middle Eastern countries who reported on their competition in order to remove those that were becoming economically dangerous to them because of their competition and therefore their absorption of the market, leaving the inferior in power with the rest of the market in absence of what the market had desired, and having chosen its natural elite, had its elite arrested for the false promotion by the toxic femininity of the Confederacy. Many people don't inherently understand it, but it becomes easy to understand when you explain it according to the survivalist hamburger analogy. Let's say in a regular market you want a hamburger. What do? Well, you go to your local Burger King, you pay $10, you get a meal, and you have a hamburger. What happens if you want to build that hamburger? Well, you would actively rely on those structures or faculties or facilities, which, if become intoxicated, becomes exponentially more expensive. You would actively have to find all of the other parts. So let's say it costs you $2,000 to buy the necessary cow in order to do it, and therefore you have to pay, let's say for this specific example, you have to pay $1,000 to the butcher, which then exponentially increases the price. Then you have to drive the cow to the butcher. You have to have a vehicle that's capable of doing that. You have to get the butcher to do the butcher work. You have to freeze the meat and package the meat. So you have to hire people to package the meat. You have to actively send it to all of the other parts in order to, as a collaborative central position, find all of the other mechanisms in order to have not wasted those materials, which require other exponential investments. You would have to have a garden in order to have grown the necessary lettuce and tomatoes and onions and so forth, right? So you understand that you have to bake your own bread, and therefore you have to have grown your own wheat, and therefore you had to hire people to do all of these roles. You have to hire someone in order to turn the wheat into bread with the proper leaven and the rest of the ingredients. And all of these parts exponentially put together very well might be about $45,000, in which case your single, immaculate, perfect, regular, common, accessible burger, your Wendy's burger, your Burger King burger, your McDonald's burger, costs $45,000 in order to have made by yourself in the state of survival. So you understand the exponential cost by not having these faculties if you being stuck in an intoxicated state with the existence of your relationship to that burger becomes overwhelmingly burdensome, requiring all of the investments into the support structures to even make it possible to have spent the $45,000 for your single burger, all of which would have to actively be maintained if you would like to spend another $45,000 for a second burger at a future date, in which case you would need all of the other investments exponentially in order to have sustained those structures, which by themselves have to exist and have to not bother the people who are hired to do it too much as to allow them to be retained in the faculties in order to have done it in the first place, in which case you would have exponentially had to have increased the amount of other customers to engage in the support structure so that you could have used the additional waste in order to continue the stabilization of that system, in which case you have at that point paid for the franchisement of whichever burger of your choice you wanted to spend $45,000 on. This, of course, exponentially increases the product of the existence of the burgers, which then allows it at a larger distribution to have sustained those sales, lower the cost of the burger from $45,000, which is the same $45,000 even if you make all of the other sales, except for the cost of the faculties are divided. When you sell the other burgers, you can, in fact, subsidize the cost of those faculties, sustaining the money speech to engage in the function of those faculties, or the lifeblood of the faculties, or the factories, respectfully, which then maintains the structure of the franchise corporation, which sells the burgers, making the $45,000 burger exponentially cheaper and cheaper as the other costs are subsidized by the existence of those sales. So that $45,000 burger then exponentially becomes easier and easier to deal with, as its cost to you, while it was originally $45,000, is still $45,000, but to you it is gone down to the $5 or the $10 if you incorporate it in a meal, which by definition required you to engage in all of the additional faculties necessary, such as the growing of the potatoes for the fries, or the plastic or the cardboard in order to make the drinks, or the syrup in order to make the drinks, and so forth. At which point, all of these parts exponentially by themselves are a catastrophic price burden onto the bearer of the person who wants that original burger meal. This has to be subsidized or becomes unsustainable, as the existence of it being sustained requires you to be able to purchase it again, and being able to purchase it again requires the retaining of those faculties who have to consistently getting paid, or they'll find something else to do as their availability is limited. And seeing as how they would like their own things, such as their own burgers, they would want to have found alternative employment, not just this unreliable one-time $45,000 burger which they've received minimum wage for, as $45,000 for a single burger was cutting all of the costs that you were able to get away with by tricking them into their agreed wages, which in this example very well might be a scam, as the promise of the wages would be determined upon consistency, and the application of that consistency would exponentially increase the price of that burger. But the $45,000 burger is in fact cheating those people, which you perfectly are happy to fire at the end of that time if the structure of sustaining it with finding alternative resources in order to stabilize those faculties are not discovered, creating negative relationships and tensions derived by the having scammed them by the non-consistent work opportunities, having robbed their time, which you have taken, which has been taken away from alternative employment, which they would view as necessary or desirable to have acquired in order to have not wasted so that they could have used the resources for their own purposes, at which point this bad taste in their mouth exponentially increases their unionization and collaborations in any legal structure within side societies, retaliating against the party for having been so malicious towards them and abusive in this relationship, where they, having been promised the concept, were sold a false bill of goods, also that you can enjoy your $45,000 $5 burger. Now, with that in mind, that is the War on David ideal, as the structure of those manipulations are seeking to have that weakness specifically exploited as the RICO abuse from the communist market who worship starvation, and that worship of the starvation facilitates the position of the people who desperately need the resources from that relationship to not be able to have on, at which point they break faith to the arrangement, which then stabilizes the position of disloyalty, not allowing for the $45,000 burger and therefore the non-existence of the franchise, which then removes the thing needed. Now, in the Warren David position, the burger in question is the existence of the American government, and its continuation, having lost those essential parts, have exponentially broken down and traumatized towards the subversion of the American interests, and not having proper representation of the public exponentially makes everyone vulnerable, which increases the viability of the frauds of the right of sale of conquest, which, having sold out the public, which have relied upon the government in order to have had all of its parts, including David's burger, which then maintains the structure of its absence, guaranteeing as an absolute certainty the sale of them into slavery by absence of that immaculate, delicious, savory burger. And since the Marxist starvation war of attrition subject is a religion of starvation and famine and poverty, a compulsion of socialism for equal poverty, materializing the charismatic socialism in order to lower sexual or other attractiveness appeal in order to engage in the desirability of everyone so that everyone would have the same value in common, and therefore each person not having the particular desires met are going to ignore it in favor of some other would be rejected, as they're all functionally the same value as enforced by the surveillance structure in the right to sale of conquest, from the experimentation having taken the right of security in the person, the papers and effects of their person, which then maintains the position of its violation in that experimentation, whereas the women that claim for abortion, stating that it's my body, my choice, and under the Constitution that would have been valid, but having been sold in the right of conquest to their enemies, it is no longer their body, as they are subject to arbitrary capture and slavery for exploitation, in which case they, being property, can be experimented on and leveraged as cattle and property of somebody else that is possessing them that is not themselves, and therefore they, being subjugated to the subject, could not make their own choices and specific preferences from a free market, which would be theft from the Communist Party, which has dictated their things for them, and therefore their values in the starvation market must be sustained lest they insult rudely the communists who possess them according to the right of sale of conquest that has sold them as property. It is not their body, and therefore it is not their choice, and therefore the function of them choosing relationships not dictated, such as romantic, becomes a sexual entanglement, which, having been sex from a prostitute not aligned by the Communist Party to a blacklisted party to that prostitute, is theft from the Communist Party. Now, while many of the Marxists from the universities would actively support this, they, having been constructed as an artificial left or an alt-left, maintains the hyper-radicalization from these salaries, accelerating the positions, the retaliation from the false fight with the alt-right, who is the foundation of the Marxist Party itself, at which point them fake arguing with the alt-right maintains the position that has sustained their Marxist university indoctrinations, where they actively having postured the position such as my body, my choice, which is actively rejected by the Communist Party, which acknowledges that it is not their body and therefore it is not their choice, and therefore they, being subject to the alt-left, are subject to its creators, the alt-right. And the alt-right, such as Lindsey Graham's Confederate Party, is the white supremacist communism or the Marxist Party that they are subordinated to on purpose. So when they fight the alt-right, stating that they have an opposition to this concept, they are actually serving it with absolute fervor and veracity, as the position of them receiving the benefits of the slavery have proven the contemptible position of having sold their souls to the Communist Party, worshipping their exact enemy, who will abuse them as their natural state as enemies. And their enemies, as subordinates, become this subversion from this abusive relationship in the Hegelian dialectic. Now, as the subject goes, the mechanism of the contradiction is actively infused in the entirety of their fake reality in the simulation, which is the foundation of everything that they rely on, as the rejection of reality is the foundation of their religious practices, which must be observed in that facilitation, which then materializes the function of their loyalty to being abused as a restraint or retardation in order to engage in the functions of those benefits as shit goes downhill, under the functional belief that a slave does not dream of freedom. A slave dreams of having slaves of their own. And they have accepted the position of being abused so long as they get to abuse somebody else in the shit running downhill. And as long as they have someone to harass, this then becomes an acceptable agreement in their arrangement, as they, as communists, do not trade money under capitalism, they trade people, as the function of the community has hyper-concentrated the facilitation of the entirety of the community in common under communism, maintains the position of the trade of the common, which then divides each of the persons into shares, which then maintains the position of the property of the common, which then can be distributed and used for the purposes of the common, and the hierarchies derived by this anarchist insurrectionist for the Communist Marxist Party of the white supremacists, who have created the KKK, and having done so, have derived by their insurgencies the mechanism of the hyper-deceleration by the hyper-diffusement of power after the hyper-concentration of power in the contradictory structure, which then maintains the position of the resurrection of replacing the police force with the Klan, which then replaces the courts with the Klan rallies, which then replaces the executive as the function of terrorism, and the courts as a function of the fraudulent, corrupt structure of whatever thing they could rally the mob into, which then maintains the act of harassment and abuses historically understood by the white supremacist hate group, which then replaces the arbitrary functions from the legislator, which then, as an arbitrary function, is whatever the dictates of the leaders of the clan and their wizard circles maintains and sustains the full control over everything that resides inside of that wizard circle, which is empowered by the consent of all of the parties involved, requiring them to have subtly told the truth in all of its parts throughout the system, whereas the position of them telling the truth and telling the people to not take it seriously as the violation of the rules would be fundamentally offensive to them, but their acceptance of it is their acceptance of them. And the breaking of the delusion of them no longer accepting it would be the breaking of the power, and therefore it becomes a self-inflicted injury because they refuse to break it and therefore do it to themselves. which is derived by history of compounded gross negligences and absence to have provided the necessary force in order to sustain themselves, or necessary precautions in order to have not sustained the injury, at which point the dereliction of duty to that extent of their own protections of themselves and their families is self-inflicted. A decision made every single day of every single week of every single month of every single year, at which point the opposition to that obligation positions themselves to the ability to escape it, but the spell entrapping them maintains the obligations to keep them distracted in acceptance and compliance with the bondage which they have put upon their own wrists. As they are shackled and dispersed, as they have been sold as slaves and cattle, and therefore able to be taken away by the bonds which they have accepted upon their own fraudulent self-deceit and evilness. They, in short, have been subject to the demoralizing structure, which, fundamentally, having proven them to have been evil, and they are evil because they are stupid, and they are stupid because they are evil. And this self-feeding loop of retardation maintains the whole of their existence and the value of their mind, which no longer has possession over its soul, which they have sold for scraps in starvation years, which, from a point of starvation at the bottom, the value having dropped, was sold at the bottom instead of being sustained, and therefore they, having been sold on the cheap by themselves, have afflicted themselves with their own insufferable, intolerable incompetence, derived by the madness of crowds and the malice of their society. In conclusion, in order to be short and brief, the system requires to pay the takings costs of the fair market value at the obstructed estimate, maintaining its resurrection to fund the mechanisms of the legal activities for the correct use of money speech for the purposes of its engagement of the government, and rights, such as, but is not limited to, the right to life, which is existence and human decency at the status afforded to the obstructed value, which may not be collapsed as a punishment in and of itself through the processes without due process, and therefore the government may not make anyone guilty and may not make the false accusations in order to use the entrapment schemes to make the person an enemy combatant. And therefore, the function of the strategies of the Marxist revolutionaries must be dissolved in its entirety as an essential aspect to secure and maintain the United States national security apparatus.